Here we have the contributions table for the project. My contributions included the level layout design and the materials used to texture the environment. I also set up the level interactables, which were openable chests, breakable walls and crates, movable barrels, and the portals. I also set up the enemies, including the FSM, health, and nav mesh system. This included animations for the enemies, which I also did for the player and the loot drops in the chest. I also set up the UI, which includes the in-game overlay, pause menu, and main menu. And I set up the tracking of variables and player data for the game and for the UI in the game manager. I also set up particle systems for the torches, which serves as the light source, and for the base fireball attack. And building on that, I also set up the player movement, attacks, and health, and the ways that the player can die. If I scroll up, you can see many of the scripts which I wrote to implement those contributions. So here in Unity, we have the project files, animations for the animations and animation controllers, audio for all the sound effects we used, bitmap for the 2D icons for the UI, external assets for any external assets we used, fonts for the UI, materials for all our prefabs and assets, including specific materials for each of the levels, original models created mainly for our projectiles and loot drops, prefabs, including breakables, level blocks, and pickups, all our scenes, and all our scripts, including stuff for enemy, passive items, and the player. Now onto the level design. I added these breakable crates, these movable barrels when hit with projectiles, torches on the walls to serve as the sort of light source for the caves, the chest rooms to give the players loot, enemies to patrol around. There's also these portals at the start and end of each stage to sort of signify where you've come from and where your objective is. The materials on the ceiling and floor and walls, I added those. And I also set up a sort of block system for rapidly creating levels. So the levels are built up of a system of prefabs for level blocks. So say look at one of these tunnels. It could be used to rapidly create larger levels. And say we go into stage 2. You can see that here. There's a lot of blocks used. Each of these is a prefab block used to make the level. And then the material also updates going into the next or future levels to sort of create a changing game environment and additional obstacles such as this breakable wall, and there's a lava crossing over here. So one of the major mechanics I implemented was the ability to open chests. Chests are scattered around the game world and give the player loot. So looking at the chest, we get this text to tell us that we can interact with it if we are within the range to interact. If we see this text, and we hit E, we open the chest, which opens it and instantiates this loot object that we can pick up. So this mechanic was implemented using 2 scripts, one called interaction behavior, which went on the main camera, and one called chest behavior, which went on the chest. The interaction behavior defines a reach distance, which is the distance that the player needs to be from the interactable object to be able to interact with it. So in every frame, we update, we check whether the player is not dead, and cast a ray from the camera straight forward to where the player is looking. We check if the hit collides with a chest. If it does, we then pop up the text above the chest to tell the player how to interact with it, and check if the player is hitting that interaction button. If so, we then call the behavior, which is to open the chest, and if not, so if the player stops looking, we remove the text from above the chest so the player can't or knows that they cannot interact with the object. So here in chest behavior, we define a few variables, including the possible loot game objects that the chest can contain, and the chest text to indicate to the player whether the chest is interactable. At the start, we inactivate this text, and also get variables that will help us later, including the player and camera transforms, and the animated component of the chest, and whether the chest has been opened. We have these 2 methods, set text and remove text, to inactivate or activate that chest text. We also have this method open chest, which opens the chest if it has not already been opened, which adds score to the player, triggers the open chest animation, plays a sound effect for opening the chest, and spawns loot half a second later. To spawn the loot, we randomly select one of the loot game objects and instantiate it at the chest position. So the scripts that I wrote were enemy behavior for implementing the FSM for enemies, enemy health for managing enemy health, magic attack for handling the fireball and ice spear behavior, player health for managing the player health, shoot projectile for handling attacks, third-person camera controller to implement our aiming mechanic, breakable for our breakable crates, breakable health for anything breakable with health, so for this our walls, chest behavior for our chest opening, fallen lava behavior for those ways of dying for the player, interaction behavior for looking around raycasting for interactions, the level manager for level related functions, as well as game management using static variables and player prefs, loot count for the loot count UI overlay for pickups, the main menu UI functions, main menu movable for movable objects such as barrels, the moving platform for the lava sort of section in one of the levels, pause menu for the pause menu UI behavior functions, and finally a script for the portal behavior. So we can look a little bit more at the breakable health script. This is for breakable objects that have health. It requires a pieces game object for the pieces that the breakable object will break into, and other variables such as explosion force and radius for defining the breaking that happens, and slider for the health, and sound effects. So the slider will be found and set at the start. When you take damage, the slider amount will update, and eventually once the object runs out of its starting health, it will break. It takes damage when the collision is with an attack, and when it breaks, it instantiates the pieces, applies forces to the pieces so that they scatter to the rigid bodies, plays a sound, the original game object is destroyed, and the pieces are destroyed a little bit later.